From the outside, these celebrity marriages looked absolutely flawless. The husband was polished, talented, and admired. The wife was famous, radiant, and seemingly secure beside him. But old Hollywood glamour had a ruthless way of hiding quiet pain. The real story didn't come out until years later, when scandals, biographies, and hindsight finally exposed what the public never saw at the time. This is a story about iconic women who gave their hearts to marriages that were, in one way or another, built on a hidden foundation. Once you know what was truly happening behind closed doors, those perfect photographs never looked the same again. Number 1. Judy Garland. When Judy Garland married director Vincente Minnelli in 1945, studio boss Louis B. Mayer personally walked her down the aisle. It was a picture-perfect moment, heavily photographed for the press. But it also functioned as something closer to a handoff. MGM didn't just dictate Garland's grueling work hours or the medication she was given to stay awake on set. The studio actively shaped the reality she was allowed to live in, as a young woman almost entirely isolated by the studio system. Minnelli represented a safe, artistic anchor. He had made her look luminous in Meet Me in St. Louis, and MGM executives strongly encouraged the match. What the studio knew, and carefully left out when steering their most bankable star toward the altar, was that Minnelli had lived a fairly open life with other men during his earlier years in New York theater. Hollywood required a traditional narrative, though, and Judy was cast as the unsuspecting leading lady in his cover story. Garland went into the marriage expecting the kind of conventional romance her own movies sold to audiences. Instead, she found a quiet, deteriorating arrangement. The illusion finally broke when she reportedly came home and found her husband involved with a male employee. The facade didn't crack slowly. It collapsed all at once. The damage went far beyond one failed marriage. The studio system had conditioned Garland to accept a distorted idea of affection, teaching her that her worth was tied entirely to her image. That left her vulnerable to men who needed her star power for their own protection. Years later, her fourth husband, Mark Herron, would also eventually leave her for another man. Garland wasn't simply a woman with bad luck in love. She was shaped by a machine that used marriage as a public relations tool, sending a performer who gave everything to the camera home to a hollow, manufactured life. Number 2, Angela Lansbury. At 19 years old, Angela Lansbury came home to find a note waiting for her. Her husband, actor Richard Cromwell, had written only that the marriage could not continue. He had packed his things and left. No argument came before it, no slow decline. Just a sudden final exit. Lansbury had married Cromwell less than a year earlier. In 1945, she was a fresh face in Hollywood, a teenage British transplant who had already earned an Academy Award nomination for her debut in Gaslight. Cromwell, 35, was an established and handsome fixture of the local social scene, his own leading man days beginning to fade. To the young actress, he represented sophistication and stability inside an overwhelming industry. She was drawn to his polished charm, unaware that at least part of it was a carefully rehearsed performance. Unlike the studio-engineered unions built to protect box office returns, this marriage worked more like a private kind of camouflage. Cromwell needed the cover that a bright, respectable young wife could provide, a buffer against the industry's rumor mill. Lansbury, shielded by her own youth and the rigid worldview of the era, simply didn't have the framework to recognize what was happening. She later admitted, with total honesty, that the thought never once crossed her mind that her husband was gay. The devastation she felt reading that note came from watching her entire understanding of the relationship collapse at once. She hadn't just lost a partner. She realized she'd been part of a story she was never given the full script for. Still, in a town where scandal could end a career overnight, Lansbury chose not to expose Cromwell. She absorbed the blow, protected his privacy for decades, and quietly carried an early, painful lesson about the gap between a Hollywood image and the man living behind it. Number 3, Phyllis Gates. When Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates married in a hurried Santa Barbara ceremony in November 1955, the union looked less like a romance and more like a high-stakes business merger. Hudson was Universal Pictures' most valuable leading man, a towering heartthrob whose private life was dangerously close to being exposed by the tabloids. To defuse the threat, his powerful agent Henry Wilson needed the ultimate PR shield, a respectable wife. He found her sitting right outside his own office, his secretary, Phyllis Gates. Historians remain sharply divided on Gates, making her one of the most debated figures in the story of Hollywood's so-called lavender marriages. For decades, she maintained that she was genuinely in love, completely swept off her feet, and had no idea her husband preferred men. Others in the industry have argued it's unlikely that her boss's own secretary was unaware of what the arrangement really was, suggesting she may have gone in with open eyes. Whether she was an unknowing participant in a studio-engineered deception, or a willing partner in a lifelong agreement to keep quiet, the day-to-day reality of the marriage was suffocating either way. She was expected to play the adoring wife for the cameras, host dinners, and maintain an illusion that demanded constant vigilance. Behind closed doors, the relationship was marked by long absences and growing distance. When the marriage ended after just 3 years, Hudson walked away with his leading man image fully intact. Gates was left to quietly carry the public stigma of a failed marriage, forever tied to a secret she was either tricked into keeping or hired to protect. Number 4. Barry Berenson. Barry Berenson first met Anthony Perkins at a party in 1972. Though as a fashion photographer, she'd been studying his face for years already. She was a vibrant part of the liberated New York art scene, sharp, connected, and socially aware, not a sheltered studio contract player from Hollywood's golden era. Yet when she married Perkins, a man whose private life had long been tied to Hollywood's hidden gay circles, she stepped straight into a web of mid-century secrets. While some women on this list were completely blindsided by their husbands' hidden lives, Berenson's story points to a different kind of weight, the burden of being a willing protector. Given her instincts and industry connections, it's unlikely she was entirely unaware of the long-standing rumors surrounding the star of Psycho. Instead, their marriage appears to have been a genuine, complicated bond built on a quiet compromise. She traded the open, bohemian world of her youth for a life with much stricter boundaries, giving Perkins the conventional family structure he wanted and a safe harbor from a society that would have gladly destroyed his career. But playing protector means absorbing every blow meant for the person you're shielding. When the AIDS epidemic began sweeping through the country in the 1980s, the stakes of Perkins's hidden history shifted from professional risk to genuine devastation. Berenson didn't walk away. She turned their home into a fortress, becoming the gatekeeper standing between her husband's declining health and a tabloid culture eager to expose him. She set her own story aside so his could stay intact. In an industry that often treated wives as disposable PR tools, Berenson carried one of the heaviest roles of all, holding a man's most guarded truth in private while maintaining the illusion in public. Number 5. Elsa Lanchester. Elsa Lanchester didn't learn her husband's secret from a tabloid leak or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, in the empty spaces of their early marriage. She and Charles Laughton were both brilliant, eccentric British actors navigating the rigid, image-obsessed machine of 1930s Hollywood. On paper, they were the quirky intellectual power couple. Behind closed doors, Lanchester faced a confusing, ongoing absence of intimacy. When the conversation finally happened, a couple of years into the marriage, Laughton admitted he was exclusively attracted to men. An era when that admission could mean prison in England and career suicide in America, the stakes were enormous. Lanchester faced a brutal choice: end the marriage and risk exposing him, or quietly rebuild her understanding of what their future would look like. She chose to stay, and what followed was a 33-year partnership that didn't fit any conventional definition of marriage. They never separated. Instead, they became fiercely loyal creative collaborators and lifelong companions. Choosing to stay didn't mean escaping the emotional cost, though. By agreeing to maintain the appearance of a standard Hollywood marriage, she gave up the chance at a conventionally fulfilling romantic life. She spent decades beside a man who cared for her deeply as a friend and creative partner, but who could never love her the way she'd once expected on her wedding day. Their marriage required constant, careful management to keep Lawton's private life hidden from studio bosses and the press. Lanchester wasn't a naive victim, and she wasn't a disposable shield either. She was the architect of their shared survival, choosing a heavy, isolating compromise because she believed protecting Lawton's talent was worth it. Number 6, Janet Gaynor. When Janet Gaynor, the first woman ever to win the Academy Award for Best Actress, married MGM's celebrated costume designer in 1939. The press sold it as a Hollywood fairy tale. Gilbert Adrian was the visionary who dressed Greta Garbo and designed the ruby slippers for the Wizard of Oz. Together, they represented the height of studio royalty. But underneath the glossy magazine spreads of their beautifully decorated home, the real nature of their marriage has long been debated by historians, challenging the idea that Gaynor was simply a wife left in the dark. Unlike younger, less experienced brides caught up in the studio machine, Gaynor was already a seasoned industry veteran by the time she married. Within Hollywood's closed circles, Adrian's homosexuality was essentially an open secret. Because of that, many historians view their decades-long partnership not as a one-sided deception, but as a classic lavender marriage, a strategic alliance built for mutual protection. The story shifts further when you look at Gaynor's own life. Persistent, well-documented rumors about her closeness with actress Mary Martin suggest Gaynor may have needed a respectable public shield just as much as her husband did. If that's true, she wasn't a victim of a cruel PR machine. She was navigating its strict puritanical rules just as carefully as he was. Even a mutual, willing arrangement carries real weight, though. To survive in an era demanding total moral conformity, Gaynor and Adrian built an airtight image of domestic life. They raised a son, entertained lavishly, and kept up a unified, traditional front that held off the gossip columnists who could have destroyed them both. Gaynor's story pushes back on the simple idea of the deceived wife and the lying husband. It reveals something more like a shared survival strategy, a genuine partnership permanently wrapped in public performance. Number 7, Charlotte Rae. For 25 years, Charlotte Rae anchored one of the most reassuringly ordinary marriages in show business. Long before she became television's favorite maternal figure as Mrs. Garrett on The Facts of Life, she and composer John Strauss built a life that seemed immune to typical Hollywood chaos. They raised 2 sons, worked together creatively, and made it through the grind of the entertainment industry side by side. A 25-year marriage isn't a PR stunt. It's an entire era of a woman's life, which is exactly what made its sudden collapse so devastating for Rae. The truth didn't come from a tabloid or a whispered rumor. It came directly from Strauss, who, well into middle age, finally told her he was attracted to men. He suggested an open marriage, hoping to keep their family structure intact, while exploring a part of himself he'd suppressed for decades. For Rae, there was no industry arrangement to fall back on, no quiet compromise to negotiate. She was simply blindsided. Discovering something like that after 25 years forces a very specific kind of reckoning. Every holiday, every quiet dinner, every shared milestone suddenly looks different in hindsight. A late-in-life revelation like this doesn't just change the future, it rewrites the past. Rae had to ask herself whether the life she'd built was real or an extraordinarily convincing performance. She ultimately chose to end the marriage, unwilling to accept a smaller role in a version of her own life she hadn't agreed to. Despite the depth of the betrayal, she never turned it into a public battle. Instead, the woman who spent her career offering warmth and wisdom to younger viewers quietly rebuilt her own sense of self, carrying the hard truth that decades of closeness don't guarantee you truly know the person beside you. Number 8, Carol Channing. At 77 years old, Broadway legend Carol Channing filed for divorce and, in doing so, unraveled a 41-year illusion. She wasn't just leaving her husband, Charles Lowe. She was publicly dismantling the carefully built image of their entire partnership. Lowe wasn't only Channing's spouse. He was her manager, her publicist, and the architect of her daily life. Through the exhausting run of Hello, Dolly, which she performed thousands of times, Lowe positioned himself as the essential barrier between his wife and the outside world. To the public, he was the devoted husband guiding her spectacular career. To Channing, He was the man who handled the money, the schedule, and the business, leaving her free to focus entirely on the stage. That professional shielding, though, doubled as a personal cage. In her divorce filings, Channing revealed a stark reality. She and Lowe had lived what was essentially a physically distant marriage for more than 40 years, with intimacy only in the very early days of their relationship. For decades, she attributed the coldness at home to their exhausting careers. It wasn't until her health began to decline and she noticed serious irregularities in her finances that the truth finally surfaced. The man managing her millions had allegedly been quietly funding a separate life, using her wealth to support relationships with other men. Channing's story shows a uniquely painful side of industry marriages, where business and romance become tangled together. Her complete trust in Lowe's authority as her manager meant she explained away the emotional distance in her own home for decades. Realizing in the twilight of your life that your most trusted partner saw you less as a spouse and more as a valuable client is its own kind of heartbreak. At an age when most people look back on a life of shared comfort, Channing had to face the fact that the man managing her spotlight had kept her completely in the dark. Number 9. Princess Margaret. When Princess Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, more than 300 million people tuned in to watch the first globally televised royal wedding. For the British monarchy, it was a badly needed public relations win. After the painful public fallout of Margaret being forbidden from marrying Peter Townsend, the royal family needed a modern, optimistic story. Armstrong Jones, a charming society photographer with a touch of bohemian flair, fit the part. But in marrying him, Margaret unknowingly traded the restrictions of royal life for a deeply complicated situation of her own. Unlike Hollywood studios, which carefully engineered lavender marriages to protect box office returns, Buckingham Palace operated with a different kind of confidence, simply assuming that anyone welcomed into the royal circle would fall in line with their expectations. That assumption meant the man behind the camera was never fully scrutinized. Armstrong Jones moved in a sexually fluid avant-garde corner of London that a sheltered princess could barely have imagined. Historians still debate how much Margaret actually knew about his bisexuality before the wedding, but her sheltered upbringing suggests she mistook his rebellious, artistic personality for simple eccentricity. As the truth about his affairs with both men and women became impossible to ignore, the marriage turned into a cold, ongoing standoff. Armstrong Jones resented the constraints of royal life and often withdrew into his own social circles, leaving Margaret isolated at Kensington Palace. He also reportedly responded to his own frustrations with small cruelties, including leaving mocking notes tucked into the book she was reading. The real tragedy of Margaret's situation was that she couldn't simply walk away. An actress might quietly divorce when an arrangement fell apart, but Margaret's role came with a duty to the crown. For years, she had to stand on palace balconies, smiling and waving, physically upholding an image of royal stability, while her husband moved freely through a life she was never permitted to question. Number 10. Martha Ray. For decades, Martha Ray was a relentless force of nature. As a powerhouse comedic performer, she spent years entertaining American troops on the front lines, earning deep loyalty from the military and the public alike. But the energy it took to project that much joy outward often hides a quiet isolation at home. By her mid-70s, the woman who once commanded massive stages across the world was in a wheelchair, weakened by a series of strokes and struggling with cognitive decline. It was in this vulnerable state that she entered her 7th and final marriage. In 1991, at 75 years old, Ray married Mark Harris, a 42-year-old promoter. To outsiders and to her own family, the mismatch was obvious. Harris was known locally for pursuing relationships with other men, bringing a very different life into her orbit than the one she'd lived. What Ray actually understood about her husband's private life is tangled up with the harder truth of what it means to grow old in an industry that quickly forgets its veterans. Unlike the young stars manipulated by studio executives decades earlier, Ray's situation points to a different kind of sadness. Her daughter and close friends fought bitterly in court, arguing that her failing memory and physical fragility made her unable to fully understand who was caring for her. Still, Harris did provide constant daily attention, stepping into a void left by an industry that had stopped calling on an aging star afraid of facing her final years alone. That companionship may have been a genuine lifeline, whether or not she fully understood the rest. Ray gave her best years to entertaining soldiers in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Instead of a peaceful retirement, her final chapter became a legal battle over her estate. A quiet reminder that not every difficult ending in Hollywood happens under the spotlight. Some happen quietly, long after the applause has faded. Number 11. Amanda Blake. For nearly 2 decades, Amanda Blake embodied a very specific kind of American toughness. As Miss Kitty Russell on the legendary Western Gunsmoke, she played a sharp, independent woman who always seemed to know exactly what was going on around her. She projected total control. Her real-life final marriage, though, showed how even the most grounded women could be blindsided by the secrecy of the era. In 1984, Blake married her 4th husband, Mark Spaeth, a prominent city councilman and developer from Austin, Texas. At that point in her life, she was stepping back from the grind of Hollywood, looking for stability and companionship. Spaeth offered the respectability of a successful local politician. What he didn't share was the carefully guarded reality of his private life. As a public figure in conservative Texas politics during the 1980s, openly identifying as gay or bisexual was seen as both a social and professional impossibility. So he kept a strict public front, and Blake unknowingly became part of that image. The cost of that secrecy went far beyond a quiet divorce. The mid-1980s marked the terrifying peak of the AIDS crisis, a disease surrounded by intense public stigma. That shame led many men in Spaeth's position to hide their health from everyone around them, including the people closest to them. When Spaeth died just a year after their wedding, the truth about his health became impossible to hide any longer. And Blake, who had entered the marriage with no knowledge of his history, was left facing a devastating reality of her own. She had contracted the illness during their brief marriage and quietly carried it until she passed away 4 years later. Amanda Blake's story is a hard reminder of what enforced silence could really cost. The pressure that pushed people to build false, respectable lives didn't just lead to strained marriages or emotionally empty homes. In its darkest form, it carried consequences that were fatal for the women standing beside them. Completely unaware, behind every one of these marriages was a woman who trusted someone completely, only to find out years later how much had been hidden from her. Some chose silence to protect the people they loved. Others discovered the truth far too late to protect themselves. Either way, their stories are a reminder that the most convincing performances in old Hollywood didn't always happen on camera. If one of these stories stayed with you, let me know in the comments which one surprised you the most. And if you enjoyed this video, like it and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.